an elderly veteran, determined to make a difference, takes on the monumental task of rebuilding a beloved orphanage, destroyed in a devastating fire. With nothing but his military grit and an unwavering sense of compassion, he sets out to restore not just a building, but the hope of countless children who once called it home. As he works tirelessly, the small town of Greenwood begins to rally around him, offering support and solidarity. But little does he know, his efforts will spark a chain of events that will change his life and the future of the orphanage forever. Will his sacrifice and dedication lead to the redemption of both the orphanage and his own past? The small town of Greenwood had always been a place where kindness and compassion thrived. It was the kind of place where neighbors helped each other and where the community came together in times of need. And it was within this town, nestled quietly near the woods, that a small orphanage stood, a place that was home to many children who had lost their parents and found solace in the warmth and care of the building and its staff. For years, the orphanage had been a beacon of hope for children who had nowhere else to go. The children were loved, cared for, and taught by the kind-hearted staff. Among the staff members was a man who was known to everyone in the town, Robert Bob Hawkins, a retired military veteran who had seen his fair share of hardship during his time in the army. Bob, now in his late 60s, had been retired for almost a decade. He had spent his years serving his country, and once his service ended, he had returned to Greenwood. For the past few years, he had worked as a janitor at the orphanage, and though his position was humble, he gave his heart and soul to the children. He didn't have much, but his heart was full of compassion, and he was a father figure to many of the kids who had no one else. One fateful night, tragedy struck. A fire broke out in the orphanage, likely caused by an old faulty electrical system. The flames spread quickly, consuming the building in a matter of hours. By the time the fire department arrived, the building was nothing but a charred skeleton of what it once was. Fortunately, the children and staff had managed to escape in time, but the orphanage was destroyed beyond repair. The loss of the orphanage devastated the town. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of hope, love, and security for the children who had called it home. Everyone in Greenwood was heartbroken, but none more so than Bob. He had spent countless hours caring for the children, ensuring they had everything they needed, and now the place that had meant so much to so many was gone. Bob was devastated by the fire. His heart ached for the children, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The children had lost their home, and they would need a place to stay, a roof over their heads, and most of all, someone to look after them. But Bob, despite his age and financial struggles, made a vow that he would do everything he could to rebuild the orphanage. The next morning, after the fire had been extinguished and the damage had been assessed, Bob stood outside the ruins of the orphanage. His eyes watered as he gazed at the burned-out remains of the building, the place that had been a second home to so many children. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and then made a promise to the children and to the town of Greenwood. "I'm going to rebuild this place," Bob said quietly, more to himself than anyone else who might have been listening. "I don't care how long it takes, I'm going to rebuild it." And with that, Bob's mission began. Bob didn't have much. He was living on a small pension from his time in the military, and his savings were slim. But what he lacked in money, he made up for in determination, grit, and the generosity of his heart. He didn't ask for help. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and set to work. For the next several weeks, Bob spent every day working at the site of the destroyed orphanage. He cleaned up the debris, salvaged what he could from the wreckage, and started to make plans for the rebuilding. Bob's military background had given him the skills he needed to manage construction projects, and he quickly set to work making sure the orphanage would rise from the ashes. The town of Greenwood was moved by Bob's determination, but many were unsure how he could possibly afford to rebuild such a massive structure on his own. People began to take notice of his efforts, and slowly, the community began to come together to support him. One by one, Businesses in the town chipped in donations, providing supplies and labor. Local builders and carpenters offered to volunteer their time. Even the children at the orphanage, who had been temporarily placed in foster homes or other facilities, sent letters and drawings to Bob, encouraging him to keep going. As the weeks turned into months, the rebuilding process progressed. Bob's dedication and hard work were contagious, and slowly, the orphanage began to take shape once again. The children's laughter and voices, once lost in the chaos of the fire, began to echo again as Bob and the townspeople worked together to restore the place they all loved. But the journey wasn't easy. There were many moments when Bob felt like giving up. The weather was unforgiving at times, the costs continued to rise, and there were days when Bob felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. But no matter how difficult things became, Bob pressed on. One day, as Bob was working at the site, a woman named Grace approached him. Grace was a local philanthropist and a longtime resident of Greenwood. She had heard about Bob's efforts and had been following the progress of the rebuild from the sidelines. Grace had always admired Bob's work at the orphanage, and she couldn't stand to see him struggle alone. "Bob," Grace said softly, "I've been following what you're doing here, and I have to say, I'm so proud of you. What you're doing for these children, for this town, is incredible. I'd like to help." Bob looked at her, his face weathered and tired. "I appreciate that, Grace, but I'm not doing this for the recognition. I'm doing it because those kids need a home. They deserve a place where they feel safe." Grace nodded, understanding his humility. "I know, but I have resources, Bob, and I'm willing to put them to good use. Together, we can finish this. I want to help make sure that this orphanage is better than it ever was before." With Grace's help, things began to move faster. She brought in contractors, hired skilled workers, and helped cover the rising costs. She also rallied support from other philanthropists and organizations that provided the financial backing necessary to complete the project. Months passed, and the orphanage gradually took shape. The once ruined building was now a bright, welcoming structure, with freshly painted walls, safe play areas for the children, and classrooms designed to foster learning and growth. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of a community that refused to give up. Finally, after nearly a year of hard work, the orphanage was ready to open its doors once again. Bob stood outside the building, looking up at the new orphanage with tears in his eyes. It wasn't just the children who had benefited from this rebuild, it was the whole town. They had come together in a way that Bob had never imagined, proving that when people unite with a common purpose, they can accomplish anything. The grand reopening was an emotional event. Children returned to the orphanage, some with their families, and others with new foster families who had taken them in after the fire. They were greeted with open arms by Bob, Grace, and the community who had worked tirelessly to make this dream a reality. As the children played in the playground, their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had once consumed the site of the fire. The walls of the orphanage, now filled with hope, echoed with the promise of a brighter future. In the end, Bob's journey was more than just about rebuilding a building. It was about rebuilding lives, restoring hope, and proving that one person's determination and heart could change an entire community. As the sun set on the completed orphanage, Bob stood outside with a contented smile, watching the children play. He knew the journey hadn't been easy, but the end result had been worth every sacrifice. The orphanage was more than a home. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people worked together, bound by love and compassion. Bob had rebuilt the orphanage, but more importantly, he had restored the faith and strength of a community that would forever remember the power